The morning they let me out, it was raining. Not the dramatic kind of rain you see in movies, where the sky opens up and washes everything clean. Just a gray, steady drizzle that soaked through my jacket before I even reached the end of the parking lot. I stood there for a minute with a paper bag holding everything I'd come in with, my wallet, my watch, a set of keys that didn't open anything anymore, and I just breathed. Cold Oregon air, diesel exhaust from a transport van idling nearby, the smell of wet asphalt. 63 years old, and I was starting over with a paper bag. I didn't call anyone. I'd arranged a cab the week before through my attorney's office. The driver didn't say much, just glanced at me in the rearview mirror once and turned the radio to a country station. I watched the fields pass by and tried to remember what it felt like to be a person who made his own choices. 19 months. That's how long they'd had me. 19 months of my life. Gone. Because my son and his wife decided that what I'd built over 40 years belonged to them. I need to back up, because if I just tell you the end, you won't understand what it cost me to get there. I built Hargrove timber and land from nothing. That's not an exaggeration. When I was 22 years old, I bought a used chainsaw and a '78 pickup truck and started taking contracts nobody else wanted. Clearing brush, cutting fire breaks, hauling logs for ranchers in Central Oregon who didn't have the equipment to do it themselves. My wife Carol was working the front desk at a dental office back then. We lived in a single-wide trailer outside of Bend for 4 years. We ate a lot of eggs. We didn't complain. By the time I was 40, I had 12 full-time employees, a fleet of 4 trucks, and contracts with 2 of the largest timber companies in the Pacific Northwest. By 50, I had a real office, a real house, and enough in the business account that I stopped checking the balance every morning with my coffee. Carol and I had 2 kids. My daughter Claire, who's the older one, lives up in Spokane with her husband and works as a school librarian. She's steady. She always was. And then there's my son Marcus. Marcus was always the one who needed more. More attention, more money, more validation. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it's true, and because I spent 30 years pretending it wasn't, and that pretending is part of how I ended up standing in a prison parking lot in the rain. Marcus married a woman named Tanya when he was 29. She was sharp, quick-talking, had a business degree from the University of Oregon, and opinions about everything. I didn't dislike her. Honestly. For the first few years, I thought she was good for him. She pushed him to be more focused, got him to stop bouncing between ideas and actually commit to something. What she committed him to eventually was destroying me. It started the way these things always start, with something that looked like help. Marcus came to me in the spring, must have been about 3 years before everything fell apart, and told me he wanted to get more involved in the business. He was 36, working a mid-level job at a logistics company in Portland that he hated. He said he wanted to learn the operation from the ground up, maybe eventually take over when I was ready to step back. I was 60 at the time. The idea of a succession plan didn't sound crazy. I brought him in as operations coordinator, gave him access to the scheduling systems, the vendor accounts, the payroll software. I walked him through everything. I sat with him every Tuesday morning for 3 months going over how the business worked. I thought I was building something that would last past me. What I was actually doing was handing him the keys. The first sign that something was wrong came about 18 months in. My accountant, a woman named Sylvia who'd been doing my books for over a decade, flagged an irregularity during a quarterly review. A payment to a vendor called Pacific Ridge Consulting, $47,000 paid out in 2 installments. She didn't recognize the name and couldn't find a corresponding contract or service record. I asked Marcus about it. He had an answer ready. Said it was a consulting firm he'd brought in to assess our equipment depreciation schedule, that he meant to loop me in, but the timeline had moved faster than expected. He seemed slightly annoyed that I was questioning him, which I now understand was deliberate. He knew that if he acted like the question was an insult, I'd back off. And I did. I told Sylvia to note it and move on. There were 3 more payments like that over the following year. Different vendor names. Different amounts. I asked about 2 of them. Both times Marcus had explanations. Both times I accepted them. I was 61 years old and tired, and I wanted to believe that my son was doing what he said he was doing. Sylvia retired that spring, and I hired a new accountant, a younger guy Marcus had recommended. I didn't think anything of it at the time. The call came on a Tuesday in October. It was a detective from the Oregon Department of Justice, Financial Crimes Unit. He asked if I could come in for a conversation. Just a conversation, he said. He had some questions about the financial operations of Hargrove Timber and Land. I went in voluntarily. I didn't even bring an attorney. That was my first mistake. Over the next 2 hours, they laid it out for me. Over the previous 22 months, approximately $1.2 million had been moved out of Hargrove Timber and Land through a series of fraudulent vendor payments, a shell company registered in Nevada, and a business account I allegedly held at a credit union in Medford that I had never set foot in. The account had been opened with a copy of my driver's license, my signature on the forms, and an address for a P.O. box I didn't know existed. The account had my name on it. The transfers had my digital authorization codes, the email correspondence establishing the shell company's contracts, emails sent from my business account, used my name, my phrasing, my sign-off. Mr. Hargrove, the detective said, we've been building this case for several months. The evidence is fairly extensive. I told him I didn't do it. I told him I didn't know what any of this was. I told him someone had set me up. He nodded in the way that people nod when they've already decided you're lying. I was arrested that afternoon. They let me call Claire, and I told her to find me an attorney. She was crying so hard she could barely write down the name I gave her. I sat in a holding cell for 11 hours, thinking about the business I'd built, the employees who depended on it, and my son, who had not called and had not shown up and whose phone, when Claire tried to reach him, went straight to voicemail. The bail hearing did not go well. The prosecution argued I was a flight risk. I had a passport, I had financial resources, or had, before they froze the business accounts, and I had allegedly committed a sophisticated financial crime that demonstrated planning and deliberation. My attorney argued back, but the judge said bail at $400,000. I couldn't cover it without liquidating assets that were now frozen. I sat in a county jail cell for the first 11 days, waiting for my attorney to find a way through the financial maze. Claire drove down from Spokane. She was there every visiting day. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week, and I told her she didn't have to keep coming, and she looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Dad," she said, "I know you didn't do this." That was the thing that kept me going for a long time. Claire's face through that plexiglass. Completely certain, no hesitation. Marcus visited once in that first month. He sat across from me and said all the right things. That he was shocked. That he believed in me. That the whole situation was a nightmare. He reached across and put his hand over mine on the counter and looked me in the eye and said, "Dad, we're going to get through this." I believed him. Even then, after everything, I believed my own son. The trial came 8 months later. My attorney was good, experienced, methodical, but we were working against a prosecution that had thousands of pages of documentation, digital records, and a financial forensics expert who spent 2 days walking the jury through spreadsheets, account transfers, and emails that all pointed in one direction, at me. We couldn't afford our own forensics expert. The business accounts were frozen. My personal savings were largely frozen as evidence. Claire offered to help, but she didn't have that kind of money, and I wouldn't let her go into debt for a fight that was mine. There was one moment in the trial I still think about. Marcus was called as witness by the prosecution. He testified that I had spoken to him about restructuring the company's financial exposure. He said I'd mentioned offshore possibilities. He said he'd been concerned, but hadn't known what to do. He did not look at me once during his testimony. I watched my son sit in that chair and explain, in a calm and reasonable voice, why it made sense that his father would steal from his own company. He was believable. He'd had time to prepare, of course. And Tanya, who sat behind him in the gallery, was crying softly at exactly the right moments. The jury came back after 2.5 days. Guilty on 3 counts of wire fraud. guilty on 2 counts of money laundering. The judge sentenced me to 34 months. With the time I'd already served and good behavior, I'd be looking at around 20 months. My attorney said we'd appeal. I barely heard him. I am not going to pretend that prison was survivable because of some inspirational mindset I found. It was survivable because I had no choice, and because of a man named Theodore, who had been in for 11 years on a fraud conviction of his own. One, he told me, quietly and without bitterness, had also involved people he'd trusted. Theodore was 67. He'd been an accountant before. He had a slow, careful way of speaking and an absolute refusal to be dramatic about anything. He became the first real friend I made after 60. He also, over several months of patient conversation, helped me understand something I'd been too overwhelmed to think clearly about. The account, he said one afternoon. The one in Medford. Someone had to open it. Someone had to be there. I know, I said, but I don't know how to prove that person wasn't me. Banks have cameras, he said. I wrote to Claire that night. I told her to hire a private investigator and focus entirely on that branch in Medford. I told her to get the security footage records however she could and to find out exactly when that account was opened and who was physically present. It took 4 months. The bank had retained digital security footage on their servers longer than the standard window because of a system upgrade that had paused their deletion schedule. The private investigator my attorney's team hired subpoenaed the records as part of a civil motion. The footage showed Marcus and Tanya walking into that branch on a Wednesday morning in March, 26 months before my arrest. Marcus was wearing a baseball cap and carrying a folder. They sat with a personal banker for 47 minutes. They left together. I was in Portland that day. I had a meeting with a timber contractor that was documented, witnessed, and logged in 3 different places. My attorney filed an emergency motion. The DA's office, to their credit, moved quickly once they had the footage. They'd built their case on me, but they weren't in the business of ignoring a recording that showed someone else opening the account. Marcus and Tanya were arrested on a Friday morning. I got the call from Claire on a Sunday, 11 days before my release date. She was crying again, but different this time. "Dad," she said, "it's over. It's actually over." I didn't say anything for a while. I sat on the edge of my bunk with the phone against my ear and looked at the floor and thought about Theodore, who'd been transferred to another facility 3 months earlier and who I'd said goodbye to through a chain-link fence. I thought about how I was going to track him down when I got out and make sure he had a real attorney looking at his case. I thought about all of it. The DA issued a formal statement acknowledging the wrongful prosecution and moved to vacate my conviction. A judge signed the order on the Wednesday of my final week. I was officially exonerated 2 days before I walked out. There was no ceremony. No one from the state came to shake my hand. My attorney handed me a copy of the vacatur order and said it was a good result. I thanked him and folded the paper and put it in my jacket pocket. Now here's the part people always ask about when they hear this story. What did I do when I got out? Did I confront Marcus? Did I go to the house or call him? Or show up at the jail where he was being held? No, I took that cab back to Bend. Claire had arranged for me to stay at a friend's house, a woman she'd gone to high school with who had a spare room and didn't ask questions. I slept for about 14 hours straight. When I woke up, it was dark again, and someone had left coffee and a plate covered in foil outside my door. I ate sitting on the edge of the bed, and then I made a list. I have worked since I was 17 years old. I know how to take a problem apart and solve it in pieces. Sitting around waiting to feel okay again has never been my approach to anything. The business wasn't completely gone. The fraud had caused enormous damage. Vendor relationships broken, accounts wiped, reputation shredded in the industry press. But the equipment still existed. The contracts that predated Marcus's involvement had lapsed rather than dissolved. And a few of my oldest clients had quietly reached out to Claire during the trial to say they'd been following the case and hope things worked out. I called those clients first. It took me almost a year to get Hargrove back to something functional. I had to rebuild everything from scratch. New accounts, new accounting firm, new operating software. I hired back 2 of my original employees who were still available and willing. I worked 6 days a week. I was 63 years old and I worked like I was 22 again, because in some ways I was starting from the same place. Marcus and Tanya's trial took 18 months to get to court. They were each charged with wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and perjury. Marcus for his testimony at my trial. They hired private attorneys, which used up most of what they'd managed to hide before the arrest. I was called as a witness. I sat in that same courthouse, in a chair not unlike the one Marcus had occupied when he testified against me, and I answered every question directly and without embellishment. I did not look at Marcus the whole time. I looked at the prosecutor and I told the truth. He was sentenced to 6 years. Tanya received 4.5. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, specifically noted the cruelty of framing a parent and the destruction of a legacy business built over a lifetime. Marcus's attorney requested that I submit a character letter on his behalf for sentencing consideration. I declined. I didn't write a letter calling for more punishment either. I just declined. Whatever I felt about my son at that point, I had said in that courtroom, under oath, and I didn't need to add anything more. His parents, Marcus's in-laws, Tanya's parents, who had treated me with such coldness after my arrest and who had taken their daughter's side so completely and publicly, sent me a handwritten letter after sentencing. It was 2 paragraphs, an apology. I read it twice and put it in a drawer. The first time I visited Marcus in prison, I went alone. Claire didn't know I was going. It was about 4 months after his sentencing. He looked diminished. That's the only word I can think of. The performance he'd sustained for years, the confidence, the explanations ready at the tip of his tongue, the hand on my arm, all of it was gone. He looked like a man who'd finally run out of room. We sat across from each other. I'd thought about what I was going to say for a long time. In the end, I said almost nothing. I don't know if I'll ever understand it, I told him. And I'm not asking you to explain it today, but I'm here. That means something, even if I don't know exactly what yet. He didn't say much. He nodded. His eyes were wet. I drove home and I didn't feel better exactly, but I felt like I'd done the human thing. And I'm old enough to know that sometimes that's the most you can do. I still run Hargrove Timber and Land. We're not what we were, maybe 60% of our former operation, but we're growing again, slowly and carefully, which is how I've always preferred to do it. Sylvia, my original accountant, came out of retirement to help me rebuild the books during the first year. She worked for 2 months and wouldn't take a salary. I eventually wore her down and she accepted. I think about Theodore regularly. His case is being reviewed by a wrongful conviction project based out of Portland. I've donated to their work. Whether it helps him specifically, I don't know, but I know what it meant to have someone in my corner when I had almost nothing, and I'm not the type to forget that. There's a version of this story where I tell you I forgave my son and everything healed, and we rebuilt our relationship into something better and stronger than before. I don't know if that version is true yet. Maybe it will be. I visit him every few months. The conversations are short. He's working in the facility's wood shop, which I find almost too on the nose to think about for very long. What I can tell you is that the business is mine again. The name on the sign, the trucks in the lot, the contracts in the drawer. Mine. 40 years of work that someone tried to take from me. They didn't. When people hear this story and ask me what I do differently, I always say the same thing. I'd have questioned more. I'd have trusted my accountant's instincts when she flagged that first payment instead of accepting a smooth answer from someone I wanted to believe. I'd have remembered that love, real love, the kind that holds, doesn't come with an explanation for why you shouldn't ask questions. But I also know that the thing that let Marcus fool me for as long as he did is the same thing that lets me visit him now. I loved my son. I still do. That's not a weakness I take back. It's a Tuesday morning as I write this. I have a site visit at 10 o'clock and a call with a new client at 2. My coffee is getting cold on the desk because I keep stopping to think about what I want to say next. Outside the window, the mountains are clear today. No clouds, just that hard blue Oregon sky that you only get in autumn. 19 months they took from me. I spent a long time being angry about that. Now mostly I just feel the weight of what's left, which is still, somehow, quite a lot. I earned that. Every bit of it. I've had a lot of time to think about how a man ends up where I ended up. Sitting in a cell at 62 years old, watching the years of your life stacked up like lumber in a yard, all that work, all that early mornings and cold weather and saying no to things so the business could grow, and knowing that the person who took it from you shared your last name. What I keep coming back to isn't the rage. The rage faded. What stays is something quieter and harder to name. It's the understanding that every outcome has a chain behind it, and if you trace that chain back far enough, you'll find choices. Marcus made choices. Parcus made choices. Marcus made choices. And those choices built a structure, piece by piece, that eventually collapsed on top of me. I'm not saying I deserve what happened. I didn't. But I did make it possible, and there's a difference between those two things that took me a long time to sit with. I chose to stop asking questions when the answers made me uncomfortable. I chose to interpret my son's defensiveness as confidence instead of guilt. I chose, over and over again, to protect the feeling of family over the integrity of the business. That's not weakness exactly, but it's not wisdom either. Theodore used to say that intelligence without honesty is just a sharper tool for getting yourself in trouble. I think about that a lot. Marcus was intelligent. He planned carefully, executed patiently, and covered his tracks well enough that it took a frozen deletion schedule at a small-town bank to undo him. But none of that intelligence was in service of anything true. It was all pointed in one direction, taking. And that kind of life eventually hollows out. You can see it in him now when I visit. Something behind his eyes that wasn't there before. Not remorse exactly. Not yet, but an absence. Like a room that's been cleared out. What I want to say to anyone who hears this story and feels some version of it in their own life is this: the work you do matters more than you think, and so does the way you do it. I built Hargrove Timber and Land with straight deals and honest handshakes, and I never once moved money in a direction I couldn't explain out loud. That's not a moral pose. It's just how I was raised and how I chose to operate. And when everything came apart, when my accounts were frozen and my name was in the paper and people I'd known for decades stopped returning calls, the work itself was still there. The reputation I'd actually earned was still there. Quiet and patient, waiting for me to come back to it. Sylvia came back. My oldest clients came back. The two guys I rehired on day one came back. Not because they felt sorry for me. Because they knew, from 40 years of dealings, what kind of man I actually was. You cannot fake that over a lifetime. And you cannot take it from someone, no matter how carefully you forged their signature. Marcus will get out eventually. I don't know what happens after that. I genuinely don't. But I know that what I'm building now, in these years I have left, is mine in a way that can't be stolen. Not because I've protected it better. Because I understand now, in my bones, that integrity isn't a strategy. It's the only thing that holds when everything else gets taken away.